Hey guys, this is Dan from learningcameras.com, and here I've got the Nikon D7100, and I also have the Canon 7D. Now the Nikon D7100 just came out, and when it did, it really produced a lot of camera for the amount of money. So you're talking $11.99, and for that, one heck of a camera. Tons of AF points on it, 24 megapixel, great low light performance, really truly an award-winning camera in many ways. You get a weatherproof design, about the weather sealing of a Nikon D800. Very good for this price. 5-6 frames a second is what I've been able to average on it. Overall, just a very, very nice and solid camera. Now compare that to what Canon has on the market. Canon is still pricing the 7D a little bit above the Nikon D7100, but since it is a kind of an older camera, it fluctuates greatly on where you buy it. But right around that $1,400–1,500 mark seems to be about where the price is at the moment. That could change in time. So now what do you get for the money? Overall, very similar as far as what they can do on that. Both of them are very solid cameras. The Canon 7D is also well built, weather sealed, great camera. You can really take a beating with it. You do have flashes with both of them. Now there are some differences too. So we're going to be dealing with a dual SD card slot on the Nikon D7100, and we have a single CF card on the Canon 7D. Now ideally, I hope that Canon will be going away from this model and starting to do what Nikon has done with the dual card slots. However, we did just see the Canon 6D come out, and that only had a single card slot, while the Nikon D600 did have a dual SD card slot. So no guarantees on what Canon is going to do with their newer models. But right now, this is all Canon has out, so let's take these two, put them side to side. We do have a Sigma 35mm lens on both of these, so we're really going to get to see exactly how they would compare with one another. So let's take a look at some of the results. Now I did want to point out some of the differences that you get with these cameras. So very similar in many ways, but there are some differences that we need to be aware of. One of those differences is if you do like to shoot HDR, you are going to get 5 frames on the Nikon D7100, while you're only going to get 3 frames in the Canon. Now that has been changed on other Canon models, so I hope that that changes to 5 or 7 frames in the future. The Canon 6D shoots 5, I believe, and the 5D Mark III will shoot up to 7. So we'll see if Canon upgrades that. But for now, if you were to pick between these two cameras, that is one thing that you're going to lose out on. Also, your controls are going to be very different, but very similar to what you're used to. So if you have a Canon system, this is really a Canon purebred camera. The Canon 5D Mark III is very similar to this. Even the 6D in many ways is still fairly familiar with this design, although you don't get the jog wheel. So it's more like the entry-level cameras. On the Nikon, very similar to what you get on the Nikon D600. Some of the other cameras that Nikon has out too. So it's not going to be different from what you're used to. Both of these cameras are really true to what the brand entails. Now there's some things I like and dislike about both of these. I love the fact that the Nikon has a bracket button here, very quick and easy access to that. Most of their buttons on the front of the camera are also in pretty good locations on that. Now I will say that the downside to the Nikon is going to be these controls right here. The ISO button is also going to be controlled by the zoom button, so you're going to have dual functions on that. It also is kind of awkwardly placed on the other side of the camera versus all the shooting controls here, whereas Canon, on the other hand, puts all their shooting controls up here. So that's something I do like about the Canon series camera than the Nikon. I do like having quick access to these buttons right here on the Nikon, so I do like this jog wheel. Unfortunately, the locking mechanism is a little difficult to get to, so I do have a love-hate relationship with this second dial right here. The first dial is very easy to get to. It does have a lock. The Canon does not have a lock on this one. I've never accidentally hit it before, so I didn't really understand the need for the lock, but it is there if you get it. Live view on both of these is going to be activated. Now I will say that in live view, if you were to go to live view for both of these, you're going to see some differences, and one of the biggest ones is that in live view for photo mode, you can change the aperture in the Canon model. The Nikon, when you do change the aperture, it will actually change the aperture. Let me take the lens hood off. It will actually change the aperture, but the differences are not going to be reflected in the scene. Whereas if I change the aperture inside of the Canon, it will actually reflect that. Not in manual mode. Let me switch over to manual real quick. it will actually reflect the aperture differences as you're changing them while you're shooting. So it is changing the aperture on the Nikon. The only difference is that you can't see it live view on the screen. Not a huge deal, but it will help you out to be able to see an actual preview of that. Now, as far as size is concerned, you do get a little smaller body with a Nikon than you do with a Canon. Not a big deal, they're very similar. And I do prefer the grip material on the Nikon. It's a very nice grip. However, the palm rest is not very large on that, so I find it slips off a little bit easier on the Nikon, but I do love the material on that. Now, one thing that's very different is even though these both have magnesium alloy bodies, the Canon does feel a little bit more metallic than the Nikon. The Nikon just has kind of that plasticky feel, even though it is built extremely well. So that's just something that you'll feel when using it, and it does help to lend itself to a premium feel for the Canon 7D versus a Nikon D7100, even though they're both similar in that weather sealing. So we will be posting the images from this review on the website, learningcameras.com. So head over there, take a look at the raw files. We're going to post them, and you can really compare these head to head, make some adjustments, and see for yourself which ones you prefer for all of these images. Now, I will say that the Nikon did shoot about a third of a stop to a half of a stop brighter than the Canon. So if I wanted to get equal exposure values, I had to dial the shutter speed up on the Nikon in almost every case to get the same amount of light level on the Canon. That's going to be a huge advantage to Nikon shooters because they're going to be able to lower their ISO most likely compared to the Canon 7D shooters, which are going to be raising it just to get the same level of exposure. So I'm not sure exactly why, maybe because the sensor is a tiny bit larger in the Nikon, but we are able to see that exposure difference. So when you're taking a look at these files, some of them I did shoot them at equal values on both of them, and some are about a third of a stop or just a little bit closed down on the Nikon to try to get them to the same values as the Canon. So take a look at both results and you can kind of see the differences. I only altered the shutter speed. The ISO values would be identical, aperture values would be identical. Just about every aperture value was shot at f8 to f13. So really ensuring the best results from the sensors on these cameras and the best results from the lenses. Now the biggest question, of course, is how these cameras shoot. And for that, we put these side by side, once again with the Sigma 35mm f1.4 lenses on both of these. These are very nice lenses, $900, made for a full frame camera, but we are going to put them on this. So they're going to be around that 50mm crop factor on this, which is a very nice crop factor to have. And also these lenses are just phenomenally sharp. So we're going to get a very equal performance, really see these cameras at their best so we can really see the results of a sensor. So you do get 24 megapixels in the Nikon. We're only dealing with 18 in the Canon. Now when we take a look at the pictures on it and see the sharpness of it, I have to say I wasn't blown away by what the Nikon offered. Even though we are able to get closer, the results when we zoomed into 100 didn't look quite as good as a Canon. And we're talking minor details here, but it did reflect. Now I'm shooting these at f8, so we should have plenty of depth of field and it shouldn't be off on the lens because of that. And really we're shooting at the best portion of the lens. But it just seems, now if we shoot these both at 18 megapixels equivalent, and we don't see this big of a difference, but when we try to zoom into 100% on the Nikon, it just isn't quite there. Now the Nikon doesn't have an AA filter, so I actually expected a little bit better results than we're getting, but I'm still seeing very similar performance, but maybe an edge out for the Canon when viewed at 100%. Now the Nikon does have a little trick up its sleeve actually. We are able to shoot this in a sensor crop mode, and what that actually does is it only uses the center portion of the sensor to create a 16 megapixel crop image, and so we get an additional 1.3 crop on that, and that is going to be huge if you like to shoot things far away. That'll turn a 200mm lens equivalent when we put it on this camera into like 300 something millimeters. So huge advantage when shooting with that crop mode if you're trying to get things far away. That can be a huge asset, and once again we're only at 16 megapixels when we use that. The Canon is only 18 megapixels when we're shooting full. So really a big advantage. We're going to get the same low light performance that we're used to because it's only using the center portion of the sensor, and we're going to get the same performance out of the lenses that we're using, actually even better performance, because we're not actually cropping on the finalized picture, we're cropping in on the sensor. So really nothing bad with using that mode other than the lost pixels, so moving from a 24 megapixel to a 16 megapixel camera. So that can be a huge asset for Nikon shooters. Now, taking these cameras into low light, this is an area that the Canon has never extremely excelled in, especially compared to most current cameras, but Nikon did increase the megapixels to 24 megapixels. So when we look at these results at 1600, very similar. It's hard to tell the difference. We are able to get a little bit closer on the Nikon, but once again, at 100%, I don't find it looking phenomenal. I almost prefer just to back off a little bit on that. When we boost that up to 3200 ISO, I will say I do think the Nikon takes a little bit of an edge here. I expected to see maybe a little bit more difference, but I think those extra megapixels are kind of hurting it a little bit. And when we take a look at 6400 ISO, the Nikon does still edge out the Canon, but once again, it's just a little bit of an edge. So basically, you're getting all of these extra megapixels for free. It doesn't cost anything because there's no drop in low light performance to pump the Nikon full of 24 megapixels versus the Canon's 18, and then we're still able to get very nice looking images up to 6400 ISO on the Nikon and the Canon. So very similar results, probably a third a stop ahead, I'd say, on the Nikon is what I am able to see. Both of these cameras, I really think, do begin to show some grain and noise and low performance at about 1600 to 3200. 6400 on both of these cameras is just lacking a little bit, and I prefer not to shoot it. Now, as far as dynamic range goes, this is an area that Nikon has always excelled at compared to the Canon, and this is really no exception. The Canon really suffers if we try to take these pictures. Now, when you take a look at the raw pictures, both of them look wonderful. Both of them are able to capture amazing detail, but one of the big advantages to shooting raw is we can take those highlights down in Lightroom and boost up those shadows and create an HDR-like image where we're getting 13, 14 stops of light inside of these cameras, and we're able to see that difference on the sensors. So when we take a look at 100% though, here's where the differences are. We're able to see some banding and a little bit of grain in the Canon inside the shadows, especially. The highlights still look good, but inside the shadows it really shows up. The blacks just are a little bit gray compared to the Nikon. The Nikon definitely does do a little bit better in this. I've seen it on pretty much every Nikon. I hope the Canon improves it in the future. It's a big asset if you're a landscape shooter, especially if your subject's a lot darker than your background is. You can really shoot about a stop or two lower in your exposure and then boost that in post and really have a better looking picture overall on the Nikon. Whereas on the Canon, you're just going to get a little bit of banding and grain in those shadow areas. Now, one big advantage that we're able to see with the Nikon, or with the Canon over the Nikon, is that the Canon is able to shoot a little bit faster and it has a much better buffer. So we're talking 8 frames a second, very quick high-speed shooting. I mean, it just races out pictures and it doesn't stop. So overall, just unbelievable before it stops. On the Nikon, it is a little bit slower, and then we only got about 5 shots before we're hitting that buffer. So you're only gonna get about 5-6 frames a second for about 1 second, whereas the Canon, I shot off about 30 shots before I started to fill up that buffer. These are equal cards. Both of these are high-speed SanDisk cards. They are Extreme Ultra, so they are the Extreme cards. There is one grade higher than that. I do have an SD card with that. I shot with that in the Nikon. It did speed it up a little bit, but I still wasn't able to get anywhere near what I can get with the Canon shooting with the same type of card in that. Now, one's a CF and one's an SD card, but very similar speeds on that, and they're nowhere near that. So if you're shooting sports, wildlife, anything like that, then you're gonna love the Canon shooting on that. Now, as far as the AF goes, there's going to be kind of advantages to each of them. So the Nikon has much more points on that. It really fills up the frame. Blown away by the results on that. You can really get focus points all over the entire frame on it. On the Canon, you get 19 points. They do fill up the frame a little bit, but they're not in the corners as well, and they are spaced out a little bit more. However, you are going to get all of them cross-type, whereas the Nikon, you're only going to get basically the center points are going to be cross-type, but anything out from that is non-cross-type. So you are going to get more accurate focusing on the Nikon, or on the Canon, using all of the AF points, whereas on the Nikon, you're going to be a little better off if you stick to any of the center points. Now, I believe it's 12 cross-type focus points in the Nikon, but I have it out in the full review of the Nikon. But overall, you're going to get, it really depends on what you're shooting. When I'm tracking objects, I did find I preferred the Nikon. When I'm shooting way far off axis, I did find myself having to compose a little bit less with a Nikon. However, if something is moving towards or away from me and I'm not tracking it, I'm picking the focus point, I do love having the Canon where I can lock in that focus point and use it to track my subject, and no matter which focus point I pick, I know that I'm going to get the best focusing available on this camera. So overall, I mean, both of these are unbelievable cameras. It's hard to go wrong with either of them. If you shoot Canon, you're going to love the Canon. If you shoot Nikon, you're going to love the Nikon. If you're shooting anything quick moving where you're going to want more than 6 frames a second, or to shoot more than a second without reaching that buffer, you're definitely going to want the Canon, because the Nikon just doesn't do it. You're going to end up at 1 frame a second after 5 shots. That's definitely something that would be unacceptable for anyone in sports, most likely. If you're shooting anything else, the Nikon is really an unbelievable camera. I love having dual SD card slots. I mean, I can't put a price tag on that because I love having backups of all of my images. Low light performance on the Nikon is unbelievable, especially considering you're getting 24 megapixels. Sharpness is very good, but not unbelievable. It's still better than what we're able to get on most cameras, and especially considering we are able to get a 24 megapixel image, even zoomed in at 100% on 24 megapixels, isn't looking very bad at all. So overall, unbelievable performance on the Nikon. The Canon still hasn't really lost it yet against the Nikon though, and Canon should be coming out with something else very soon, like the 70D or the 70 Mark II maybe in the fall. A 70D might happen a little bit quicker, so we'll have to see what Canon does to fight with a Nikon. Is the Nikon better? And it is $200 cheaper, and in many ways it is a better overall camera than the Canon. There are just some things of the Nikon that I just wish that the Canon would do. Most notably would be that dual SD card slot. Screens on both of them look great. The Nikon screen is a little bit bigger. I do have a little bit of a yellowish tint to the Nikon, which does get annoying. The auto white balance is not great. And I do shoot auto white balance because I shoot RAW, but I can change it in post, so it really doesn't bother me. But if you're trying to get a very accurate white balance, it's a little difficult on the Nikon, just because its screen tends to go a little bit more yellow than the Canon does. But overall, just great cameras. You can't go wrong with either one of them. And it just depends on what type of stuff you're shooting and which brands you're shooting with. So overall, very good. And I will say I've got both of these cameras. I'm going to have some of the shots from this review on the website, so take a look at this. Subscribe to get some more future reviews. We're also going to be doing a movie mode section on these, so take a look at the movie mode on both of these cameras.